I've always been the kind of person who could handle what other people can't. That's what I told myself when I took this job 3 years ago, fresh out of a mortuary science program, 22 years old and convinced that death was just biology with better paperwork. My mother cried when I told her what I'd be doing for a living. My friends made the jokes you'd expect, the cold hands, the smell, the late nights alone with the dead. I laughed along with them because none of it bothered me. I'd interned at a hospital morgue during my training, and nothing about a body on a table had ever unsettled me the way it seemed to unsettle everyone else. Dead is dead. That was the whole philosophy I walked in with. I work for a small funeral home on the edge of town, family-owned, the kind of place that's been quietly serving the same handful of communities for almost 60 years. My boss, a heavy-set, soft-spoken man named Mr. Averill, hired me himself after a 15-minute interview where he asked me exactly 2 questions. Whether I could keep a steady hand, and whether I could keep my mouth shut about what I saw on the job. I said yes to both without hesitation, thinking he meant client confidentiality, grieving families, the private and sometimes ugly details of how a person died. I understand now that he meant something else entirely, but it took me the better part of 2 years to understand just how much else. The work itself, in the beginning, was exactly what I expected. I assisted with embalming, dressing, cosmetic restoration for open casket services, the quiet mechanical processes that most people never think about and would rather not picture when they're standing at a viewing holding a box of tissues. I got good at it fast. There's a rhythm to the job once you stop seeing a body as a person and start seeing it as a task with steps, and I fell into that rhythm easily. Nights alone in the prep room didn't bother me. The smell stopped bothering me within the first month. I liked the quiet, honestly. I liked that nobody expected me to make conversation with the people I worked on. The first strange thing happened about 8 months in, and at the time I didn't think anything of it beyond a bad case of nerves brought on by too many late shifts. It was an elderly man, mid-80s, natural causes, the kind of case that comes through a funeral home every week without anything unusual attached to it. I had him laid out for embalming, the room quiet except for the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, and I stepped out for maybe 90 seconds to grab a fresh set of gloves from the supply closet down the hall. When I came back, his hand had moved. Not dramatically. Nothing you'd see in a movie. His right hand, which I had positioned flat against his side, was now resting slightly curled, fingers loosely closed, like someone gently making a fist in their sleep. I remember standing in the doorway for a long moment, running through every rational explanation my training had given me. Muscle contraction from settling rigor. A draft from the vent that could have shifted a limb that wasn't fully secured. My own memory being wrong about exactly how I'd left the hand in the first place, since 90 seconds isn't very long to form a precise picture of something you do dozens of times a week without thinking. I settled on the last explanation because it was the easiest one to live with, and I went back to work. It happened twice more over the following months, always small, always something explainable if you squinted hard enough at the explanation. A jaw slightly more open than I remembered leaving it. A leg that had shifted a few inches on the table when I stepped away to answer the phone. Each time I told myself the same story. I'm tired. I'm imagining things. Dead bodies settle, shift, release gas, contract muscle fiber in ways that can look almost purposeful to someone staring at them too long in bad lighting. I'd read about it in school. It was called, among other things, the Lazarus reflex, though that specific term applied more to trauma patients and brain-dead cases than to elderly natural deaths, a detail I conveniently didn't examine too closely at the time because examining it too closely would have meant admitting I didn't actually believe my own explanation. Mr. Averill noticed me looking rattled one evening after the third incident, the leg that had shifted. He asked if everything was all right, in that same soft, unreadable tone he used for almost everything, and I told him the truth, or a version of it. I said I thought I was seeing things that weren't there, that a body had moved slightly while I wasn't in the room. I expected him to laugh it off, tell me I needed more sleep, maybe suggest I take a night off. Instead, he went very still for a second, set down the folder he was holding, and asked me a question I still think about. Did it feel deliberate? I remember the question catching me off guard, because it wasn't the reassurance I expected, and it wasn't dismissal either. It was almost clinical, like he was asking me to describe a symptom. I told him I didn't know, that it was probably nothing, muscle settling, gas release, the kind of thing we'd covered in school. He nodded slowly, said that was probably it, and told me to log the time and temperature of the prep room going forward, just to be thorough. I didn't think much of the request at the time. I do now. For a long stretch after that, things were quiet. Nearly a year passed without anything I couldn't explain away, and I genuinely believed I'd let my imagination get the better of me during a rough patch. I threw myself back into the work, got promoted informally into handling more of the difficult cosmetic cases, the ones involving trauma or advanced decomposition that most assistants tried to avoid. I liked the challenge. I liked being the person Mr. Averill trusted with the cases nobody else wanted. It was a case in late autumn that changed everything, a woman in her 40s, and the circumstances of her death were listed simply as unattended, which in this line of work usually means she was found sometime after she'd passed, alone, no one checking in on her for days. Those cases are always harder, not just technically but in some quieter way that's difficult to explain if you haven't done this work. There's a particular kind of sadness to preparing someone whose absence apparently went unnoticed for that long. I had her on the table late on a Thursday night, working alone as I usually did during the week, and about 20 minutes into the process, the overhead lights flickered. Not off completely, just a stutter, the kind you'd get from an old building with imperfect wiring, which described our building perfectly. I didn't think much of it at first. But then the temperature in the room dropped, sharply, in a way that had nothing to do with the industrial refrigeration units we kept the prep room cooled with. I could see my own breath. I remember standing there with a scalpel in my hand, staring at the faint fog of my exhale in air that had been perfectly normal 5 minutes earlier, and feeling, for the first time since I'd started this job, genuinely afraid. Then she exhaled. I want to be careful about how I describe this because I've turned it over in my head so many times since that night, trying to find some rational shape for it that would let me sleep. It wasn't the involuntary sound bodies sometimes make from residual air in the lungs during certain kinds of movement, something I'd been trained to expect and had witnessed before without incident. This was slower, deeper, deliberate, the unmistakable sound of a full breath being drawn in and then released, the kind of sound a living person makes when they're settling into sleep. Her chest rose. Just slightly, and fell again. I dropped the scalpel. I don't remember deciding to drop it, I just remember the clatter of metal against the tile floor and the sudden ringing silence after it. I stood frozen at the edge of the table for what felt like a very long time, watching her chest, waiting for it to happen again, half convinced I'd imagined the whole thing and half certain that if I watched long enough I'd see it a second time and have no way left to explain it away. It didn't happen again. Not that night. Eventually, the room's temperature crept back to normal, the lights stopped flickering, and I finished the embalming process with hands that would not stop shaking no matter how many times I told myself to calm down. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept replaying the sound in my head, the specific rhythm of it, in and out, the way you'd breathe if you were trying very hard to stay calm. I told Mr. Averill everything the next morning, all of it, not the vague version I'd given him the first time, but the whole thing, the temperature, the lights, the breath. I expected him to send me for a psychiatric evaluation, or at the very least to gently suggest I take some time off. Instead, he closed the door to his office, which he almost never did, and sat down across from me with an expression I hadn't seen on him before. Tired isn't quite the right word for it. Resigned might be closer. I was hoping you had more time before this started happening to you, he said. Most people, it takes longer. A few years, sometimes more. You're fast. I asked him what he meant, and he was quiet for a long moment before he answered, choosing his words carefully, like he was deciding in real time how much of the truth I could handle. Not every case that comes through this building is finished the way it looks, he said. Most of them are. The vast, overwhelming majority of what we handle here is exactly what it appears to be. A person has died, and our job is to prepare them with dignity and send them home to their families. But every so often, maybe one case in a few hundred, something comes through that isn't quite finished yet. Something that hasn't let go all the way. I don't have a good scientific word for it, and believe me, I've spent 30 years looking for one. I just call it lingering. I asked him what lingering meant in practical terms, what it actually was, and he shook his head like the question itself was one he'd given up trying to fully answer a long time ago. I don't know what it is, he said. I only know what it does. Sometimes it's small. A hand that moves. A breath that shouldn't be there. Sometimes it's just cold air and bad lighting and nothing more ever comes of it. And sometimes, he paused here, and I remember the particular weight in his voice when he continued, sometimes it gets worse before it's finished. He told me, that morning, about a case from early in his own career, decades ago, before I was born, involving a young man who had died in a car accident, and how for 3 consecutive nights after the young man was brought in, Mr. Averill had heard footsteps in the prep room after locking up for the night, slow, deliberate, circling the table where the body lay. He told me he'd never gone back in to check, not once, that he'd simply sat in his car in the parking lot each of those 3 nights until the sound stopped and the building went silent again, and that on the 4th night there was nothing, and the case proceeded and the funeral happened without incident, and he never spoke of it to anyone until that morning with me. I asked him, feeling sick as I asked it, whether there was anything we were supposed to do when it happened. Any procedure, any protocol beyond simply enduring it and waiting for it to pass. "Don't engage with it," he said. "Whatever you see, whatever you hear, don't speak to it, don't touch it beyond what your work requires, don't look at it longer than you have to. Finish the job as professionally and as quickly as you can, and let them go." In my experience, and I want you to understand that this is 30 years of experience, not a guess, it's the attention that makes it worse. The longer you engage with it, the longer it seems to think it has an audience, and the harder it becomes to finish the process. I wanted to ask him 100 more questions that morning, but he stood up before I could, straightened his tie, and told me that the best thing I could do was go home and rest, and that we'd talk more if I needed to, but that dwelling on it too long tended to make people worse at their jobs, not better. I understand now that this was its own kind of advice, the same advice he'd just given me about lingering itself, applied to me rather than to the dead. Don't engage with it. Don't look at it longer than you have to. For a while, I tried to follow that advice. I went back to work within a few days because we couldn't afford for me not to, and because some part of me, stubborn and proud in the same way that had gotten me through mortuary school without flinching, refused to let this be the thing that broke me. Most cases continued to be exactly what they appeared to be. Ordinary. Finished. I got better, over time, at recognizing the ones that weren't, a certain heaviness in the room before I'd even touched the body, a stillness that felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate but had learned to trust. On those cases, I worked faster, quieter, kept my eyes on my hands and my hands on the task, and more often than not, whatever I sensed in the room would settle by the time I finished, the way a held breath finally releases. But some cases didn't settle so easily, and one of them, almost a year after the woman who breathed, became the case I still can't fully explain, the one that changed how I understood what Mr. Averill had told me, and what it was actually going to cost to keep doing this work. The case was a teenage boy, 17 years old, and the file simply listed the cause as an accident, without much elaboration, the kind of vague official language that usually means the full story is more painful than the paperwork wants to admit. I remember feeling the wrongness of the room the moment I unlocked the prep room door that evening, a heaviness in the air that had nothing to do with temperature, a sense of being watched that I'd learned by then not to dismiss. I worked quickly, the way I'd trained myself to, keeping my eyes down, my hands steady, moving through the process with the same clinical efficiency I brought to every ordinary case. For the first hour, nothing happened beyond the usual heaviness in the room, and I let myself believe I might get through this one without incident, the same way most of the difficult cases eventually settled if I didn't give them the satisfaction of my attention. Then I heard him breathing. It was different from the woman, months earlier. Hers had been a single exhale, brief and shallow, gone as quickly as it came. His was continuous, ragged, uneven, the labored breathing of someone in genuine distress, and it did not stop after a few seconds the way I expected it to based on everything Mr. Averill had told me. I kept my eyes fixed on my work, my hands steady through sheer force of will, repeating his advice to myself like a prayer. Don't engage with it. Don't look at it longer than you have to. Finish the job. But then he said something. I won't pretend I can be entirely certain of every word, because my hands were shaking so badly by that point that I'd stopped fully trusting my own senses, but I heard, clear as anything I've ever heard in that room, a young voice, thin and frightened, say, "It's cold. Why is it so cold?" I stood completely still, every instinct in my body telling me to run, and every hour of Mr. Averill's advice telling me to keep working, to not engage, to finish the job as quickly and professionally as I could. I chose the advice. I kept my hands moving, my eyes down, and I did not answer him, though every part of me wanted to say something comforting to a frightened boy the way I imagine anyone would want to, dead or not. I finished what I was doing as fast as my training allowed, faster probably than I should have for the quality of the work, and the breathing continued the entire time, ragged and uneven, occasionally punctuated by that same small, lost voice asking questions that no one was answering. Where am I? Why can't I move? Is anyone there? It took everything in me not to answer that last one. The breathing stopped abruptly about 40 minutes in, cut off mid-breath the way a recording might cut off, and the room's temperature returned to normal almost instantly, like a held tension finally releasing. I finished the remainder of the process in a silence that felt somehow louder than the breathing had been, and when I left the prep room that night, I sat in my car in the parking lot for nearly an hour before I trusted myself to drive. I told Mr. Averill about it the next day, and for the first time since I'd known him, I saw something that looked genuinely like fear cross his face, quickly hidden but unmistakable. "You did the right thing not answering him," he said, quietly. "I need you to understand how important that is. It's not always a hand moving or a breath you can write off as nothing. Sometimes it's aware enough to ask you questions, and the moment you answer, the moment you give it a conversation instead of a task, it stops being something you're finishing and starts being something you're keeping." I asked him what would have happened if I had answered, and he was quiet for a long moment before he told me, in the same flat, resigned tone he'd used when he first explained lingering to me, about a colleague of his from decades earlier, a mortician 2 counties over that Mr. Averill had trained alongside early in his career, a man who by all accounts had been excellent at the work, careful, respectful, deeply devoted to treating every case with dignity. He told me that man had, on at least one occasion that he knew of, answered. "He wasn't a bad man," Mr. Averill said. "He was a kind one. That's what made him answer." He heard something frightened asking him questions, and he couldn't bring himself to stay silent, because staying silent felt cruel to him. I understand that instinct better than you might think. But once you engage with it, once it has your voice as well as your attention, it doesn't let go the way it's supposed to. He kept working for another 11 years after that. But he was never quite the same afterward. He told me once, years later, over drinks, that he still heard that same voice sometimes, in other cases entirely unrelated, using the same small handful of questions like it had learned them and simply kept them, the way you'd keep a phrase in a language you'd only half learned. "Where am I? Why can't I move? Is anyone there?" He said sometimes, very late at night, alone in his own house, he heard it there too. I asked what happened to him eventually, and Mr. Averill was quiet for long enough that I understood the answer before he gave it to me. "He's not in this line of work anymore," he said, and did not elaborate further, and something in his tone told me clearly enough that this wasn't a subject I was meant to push on. "It's been almost a year since the boy who asked if anyone was there, and I'm still doing this work, still showing up most nights to a quiet building full of people who are, the overwhelming majority of the time, exactly as finished as they appear to be. I've learned to trust the heaviness in a room before I even open the door to it. I've learned the specific, particular silence that comes right before something isn't quite ready to let go. And I've learned, more than anything else, the discipline of not answering, no matter what I hear, no matter how frightened or lost or small the voice sounds on the other side of my own held breath. Some nights that discipline is easy. The room is quiet, the work is simple, and I go home without a second thought. But some nights, like a handful of weeks ago, when an elderly woman on my table began humming, very softly, a tune I somehow recognized despite never having heard it before in my life, and paused every few bars as though waiting for someone to hum the next part back to her, the discipline is the hardest thing I have ever had to do in my life. I finished the work in silence. I did not hum back. I went home and sat in the dark for a long time afterward, and I did not tell Mr. Averill about that one, not because I didn't trust him, but because some part of me is beginning to understand that the more of these stories I collect and share, even with someone who understands, the more of a shape this thing seems to take in my own mind, the more real and present it becomes, the way naming something can sometimes be the very thing that gives it a foothold. I don't know how many more years I have in me before I become the person Mr. Averill described, the one who answers despite knowing better, worn down by kindness or exhaustion or simple human loneliness into finally responding to a voice that only wants to be heard. I think about his old colleague more than I'd like to admit, the man who is no longer in this line of work, whose reasons for leaving were never fully explained to me and which I have, so far, been too afraid to ask about directly. For now, I keep showing up. I keep my hands steady and my eyes down and my mouth closed no matter what I hear in that room after the sun goes down. Most nights, that's enough. I tell myself that as long as it keeps being enough, I can keep doing this work, keep finishing what needs to be finished, keep sending people home to their families with the dignity they deserve. But some nights I lie awake afterward, running back through every case I've ever worked, wondering how many of them, in the seconds after I left the room and locked the door behind me, kept breathing in the dark a little while longer than they should have, waiting quietly for anyone, to finally answer back. Content. The deep web is one of the most amazing things on earth, not because of how joyful it makes people or anything, but because it is a completely uncensored view of people. You can speak your mind, by what you want, do anything you want. When on the deep web you have complete and total freedom. I had always be. Pasted. You will probably know about the new generation of My Little Pony. Friendship is magic. It has for one reason or another became an overnight sensation. Whether or not you like the show yourself, you have to admit that its success is impressive. However, it raises a question Lauren Faust has worked on off. Pasted. My name is Father Daniel Morrow. I've been the parish priest at St. Aldrich's for exactly 3 weeks. I'll be honest, when I was ordained, I had dreamed of something grander, a bustling city parish, perhaps missionary work overseas, even a quiet but influential role at the diocese. Instead, the bishop sent M. Pasted. The clinic always felt different at night. The fluorescents hummed louder, the stainless steel counters gleamed too sharply, and the waiting room smelled faintly of antiseptic and wet fur. I told myself I prefer the late shift. Fewer clients, fewer crises. But the truth was, it always felt lonelier. Pasted. My name is Mr. Hellbrook, and I've been teaching for more than 15 years. Long enough to know that kids are kids no matter where you go. Noisy, rowdy, and inventive in ways that adults forget how to be. But last fall, I moved north to a smaller district. I found myself in charge of a class where the C. Pasted.